I used to be the kind of man who checked his bank balance once a month, not because I was careless, because I trusted the system. I had spent 31 years inside the British civil service watching other people's money move through government accounts, watching budgets allocated and spent and audited, and the one thing that career had given me above all else was a belief that financial systems, when properly maintained, do not lie. Numbers are numbers. Accounts are accounts. Everything is traceable. Everything is findable. Everything leaves a record. I believed that completely. I believed it right up until the morning a tax accountant in London showed me a printout of 6 bank accounts opened in my name that I had never once seen, never once signed for, never once known existed, and told me, in the careful flat voice of a professional delivering information too large for any other register, that £550,000 had passed through those accounts over the preceding 4 years and was no longer traceable to any asset I owned. That morning is when I understood that the system I had trusted my entire adult life could be turned against a person from the inside, by someone who knew it better than you did, by someone sleeping in your bed. My name is Marcus Thornbury. I am 73 years old. I was born in Lewisham, South London, educated at a grammar school that no longer exists, and I spent my working life in the Department for Work and Pensions, first as a junior administrator, eventually as a senior policy advisor, which sounds more impressive than it was. It was meticulous work, careful, detailed, procedural. I was good at it. I was the kind of man colleagues called reliable, and I took that as a compliment because in my profession, reliable meant you could be trusted with things that mattered. I retired at 67 with a civil service pension that was modest but sufficient, a flat in Lewisham that I had owned outright for 20 years, and savings of just over £600,000 accumulated through 40 years of living carefully. I had no particular extravagances, no sports car, no second home, no expensive habits. What I had was the quiet security of a man who had done everything correctly. My wife Patricia died 14 months before I went to Manila. Cancer, diagnosed late, progressed quickly. We had been married for 38 years, and the quality of her absence was unlike anything I had been prepared for. Not just the grief, which was expected, which I had thought about in the abstract the way couples think about these things when they are no longer young, but the specific, practical, daily texture of being alone in rooms that had contained her for nearly 4 decades. The flat was full of her in a way that made it impossible to leave and impossible to stay in. My son Edward, he lives in Edinburgh with his family, called every Sunday without fail, and the calls were kind and inadequate in the way that all kindness is inadequate when the wound is that particular shape. I was not managing, I was enduring. There is a difference. A former colleague named Brian had retired to Cebu 3 years earlier. We had stayed loosely in touch through occasional emails, the kind of low-maintenance friendship that suits men of our generation who are better at proximity than at correspondence. He sent me a message 4 months after Patricia died, a simple, direct message, very much in Brian's register, saying that the Philippines was a genuinely good place to be old, and that if I ever wanted to see for myself, the guest room had a decent bed, and he was usually around. I did not respond immediately, but I read it many times, and eventually I booked a flight, not to Cebu but to Manila, telling myself it was just 2 weeks, just a change of air, just the thing the doctor had obliquely suggested when she said I needed to find reasons to leave the flat. I arrived in Manila in March, 5 years ago now, at the age of 68. I had arranged to spend a week there before taking the ferry to Cebu to see Brian. I had booked a small hotel in Makati, reasonable and clean, and my intentions for the week were genuinely minimal: walk, eat, adjust to the heat, speak to no one in particular. I had not thought about meeting anyone. I had not thought about anything beyond the next 7 days. When you are in the deepest part of grief, the future shrinks to the size of the immediate next thing. 7 days was as far as I could see. Erica Reyes was staying in the same hotel. I met her in the breakfast room on my second morning, which is the kind of beginning that sounds contrived but was, in the way of all genuinely important things, entirely ordinary. She was at the table beside mine, working through a spreadsheet on her laptop while eating, the particular focused posture of someone accustomed to working anywhere. She was in her late 30s, I judged professional, composed, not glamorous in an obvious way, but with the kind of neat precision in her appearance that reads, at my age, as more attractive than beauty alone. She glanced up when I sat down and nodded briefly, the acknowledgement of someone who notices people without making a project of it. We did not speak that morning. I noticed her. That was all. We spoke in the evening at the small bar off the lobby, the kind of hotel amenity that exists for guests who have nowhere particular to be. She was having a glass of wine. I ordered a beer, which I rarely drink, and sat 2 stools away, and after 10 minutes of parallel silence, she asked whether I was visiting for business or for something else. I said for something else. She said she was an accountant working a short-term contract for a Manila-based firm, something to do with restructuring their internal financial reporting systems. She said it matter-of-factly, with the slight weary precision of someone who has explained what they do many times to people who do not find it interesting. I told her I had spent my career in the civil service working with financial policy, and her expression shifted just slightly, not excitement, but recognition, the quiet shift of a person who has found someone in the same professional territory. We talked for 2 hours. About public sector accounting frameworks and why they were structurally different from private sector ones. About the particular frustrations of financial compliance work. About Manila's banking infrastructure, which she knew in considerable detail. She was extremely knowledgeable. She used terminology correctly and contextually, not as performance but as a natural medium of conversation. I found it genuinely engaging in the way I had not found anything genuinely engaging in 14 months. Not romantic, just alive, present. The particular pleasure of a real conversation with a person who knew what they were talking about. She told me she had studied in Manila and then done additional certifications in Singapore, where she had worked for 2 years with an international banking group before returning to the Philippines. She explained the quirks of the Philippine banking regulatory environment with the confident fluency of someone who had navigated it from the inside. I told her about the DWP's internal financial architecture, the particular challenges of managing pension disbursements at scale, the compliance pressures that had intensified across my final years in the role, and she listened with the specific attention of someone who found the subject genuinely interesting rather than politely tolerable. We disagreed about the relative merits of centralized versus distributed financial record-keeping in public institutions. It was, I want you to understand, one of the better conversations I had had in years. Not the best conversation I had had since Patricia. One of the better conversations I had had, full stop. That distinction matters. I postponed the Cebu trip by 4 days. This was not a dramatic decision. It was simply that Brian was flexible. The ferry ran daily, and the conversations with Erica Reyes across those 4 additional evenings were the most engaged I had felt since Patricia died. She was careful about the professional boundary, always slightly formal, always more interested in ideas than in personal territory. She did not ask about Patricia. She asked about policy frameworks and budget cycles and whether I thought the British approach to public pension accounting was structurally sustainable. I told her honestly what I thought, and she disagreed thoughtfully, and we argued about it with the polite precision of 2 people who have both spent careers in the same general field and enjoy the friction. On my last evening before Cebu, she told me, without particular drama, that she would be in Manila for another 6 weeks, and that if I came back through the city, she would be glad to continue the conversation. I told her I would probably come back through Manila before flying home to London. She gave me her number. I took it in the way I would have taken any professional contact's number, as information, not as an invitation. Or I told myself that. Even then, I knew it was not entirely true. I spent 10 days with Brian in Cebu, which was good and restorative in the way that old friendships are not demanding, not requiring performance. Just the comfortable company of someone who had known you across different versions of yourself. Brian was well and happy and slightly rounder than I remembered, and we ate excellent food and watched the sea and talked about Patricia twice, briefly, in the way men of our generation discuss loss directly enough to acknowledge it, briefly enough to avoid drowning in it. I came back through Manila on the way home. I sent Erica a message from Cebu and we arranged dinner. That dinner lasted 4 hours. I extended my stay by a week. I'm not going to tell you that I fell in love with Erica Reyes instantly or foolishly or in the way of a man who should have known better. It did not happen like that. It happened slowly, across a second trip 6 weeks later, and then a third trip, and phone calls between trips that were initially professional and gradually became personal in the way that long conversations between two people always become personal eventually. She told me about her family, her parents in a province north of Manila, her younger sister who was studying nursing, the financial pressures of supporting a family on a contract accountant's income in a city as expensive as Manila had become. She did not tell me these things as complaints or as appeals. She told them as facts, the way she told everything with a kind of flat honesty that I found, compared to the soft, careful speech of people managing a grieving man, enormously refreshing. By my 4th visit, I had been coming to Manila for 8 months. Erica and I had been meeting, and then spending days together, and then she had met me at the airport the last time in a way that was unambiguously personal rather than friendly, and the thing that had been building between us without my quite naming it was now named. I was 69, she was 39. I was aware of the gap. I was aware of what it looked like from the outside, and I was aware of what Brian's face had done when I told him, in a brief phone call, that I had been seeing someone in Manila. He had not said anything negative. He had simply said, very carefully, "Just go slowly, Marcus." I told him I was going slowly. I believed I was. In retrospect, I had no clear measure for what slowly meant, and neither did he. She came to London for 2 weeks in the spring of that first year. I introduced her to Edward when he came down from Edinburgh. Edward was civil, in the way that good sons are civil when they have reservations they have decided not to voice, attentive, pleasant, asking the right questions, watching. Erica was composed and professional and asked Edward intelligent questions about his work in architecture that showed she had remembered what I had told her about him. After she left, Edward called me and said she seemed very capable. That was all he said, very capable. I told myself it was approval. It was not quite approval. We married 14 months after we met, in a small ceremony at a registry office in Lewisham, with Edward and my sister Janet as witnesses. It was not what Patricia and I had. Nothing was what Patricia and I had I had stopped expecting it to be. What it was a genuine decision made by a man who was 70 years old and did not want to spend the remaining years of his life alone in a flat that still smelled like someone who was gone. Erica moved into the Lewisham flat. She continued working contract accountancy, now with London-based firms, which she arranged with the same efficient competence she brought to everything. The first year was good. Not without difficulty sharing a space with a new person after 38 years with the same person is its own particular adjustment. And Erica had a precision about domestic arrangements that was occasionally at odds with my more casual habits, but genuinely good in the ways that mattered. She was engaged. She was thoughtful. She cooked, which I had never mastered, and the flat began to feel like a place where someone lived rather than a museum of a marriage that had ended. I was grateful. I told her I was grateful, and I meant it. That is important to understand. Everything I felt in that first year was real. The gratitude was real. The relief was real. The affection was real. It was not performance, and it was not delusion. It was the genuine experience of a man who had been given something back that he thought was gone for good. She began helping with the finances in the second year of the marriage. Not dramatically, not a single moment where she asked to take over and I handed her the keys. It happened gradually, in the way that competent people absorb tasks in a shared household. She noticed that I was using 3 different banks for accounts that could be consolidated more efficiently. She pointed out, correctly, that I was paying unnecessary fees on one account that had not been competitive for years. She suggested a restructuring that would simplify my banking and reduce overhead, and she presented it the way she presented everything financial, with a spreadsheet, with clear line items, with a calm professional rationale that I could follow and verify. I verified it. The rationale was sound. I authorized the changes. She handled the paperwork. I did not think about it again. There were other moments across that second year that I have since catalogued with the clarity of retrospect. She suggested moving my paper statements to paperless, more environmentally responsible, she said, and easier to manage. I agreed. She helped me set up consolidated banking apps on my phone and tablet, walking me through the interfaces with the patient thoroughness of someone who does this kind of thing professionally. She had my login credentials for the purpose of setting up the apps. She recommended I give her access to the household banking for convenience, the day-to-day account from which the bills were paid, and I did so without particular thought because that is what married people do, or so I believed. Each of these moments, taken alone, was nothing. Each was the reasonable, practical decision of a man sharing a life with a woman who was more financially expert than he was. Together they were the construction of an access architecture she had been building piece by piece across the second year, so that by the time the third year began she had everything she needed. I have since spoken with Dr. Patel about the specific mechanism. She explained it to me in terms I found uncomfortably easy to follow. The first accounts were opened using my credentials, my national insurance number, date of birth, address through online banking applications, in some cases with digital authorizations that had been processed through devices I owned. The accounts were opened at banks I did not already use, which meant no duplicate account notifications on my existing banking apps. The accounts received transfers from my legitimate accounts in amounts carefully structured to stay beneath automatic review thresholds, typically under £5,000, spread across intervals of 2 to 3 weeks. From those accounts, the money was moved again, through a further layer, before leaving the UK financial system entirely. It was, Dr. Patel said, a professionally constructed layering structure, the term used in money laundering for the process of obscuring origin through multiple transfers. She said the person who built it understood the system from the inside. She said it with the careful, neutral language of her profession. I heard what she did not quite say. That is the sentence I returned to most often in the night since. I did not think about it again. A man who had spent 31 years in financial policy administration authorized changes to his banking structure and did not think about it again. I have tried to be honest with myself about why. The simplest answer is that I trusted her. A more complete answer is that she had made herself, in both her professional identity and her daily manner, into exactly the kind of person I was conditioned by my entire career to trust with financial matters. Competent, precise, detail-oriented, entirely comfortable in the language of accounts and compliance. She had not deceived me about her expertise. She was genuinely expert. That expertise was the instrument. The second year became the third, and the third became the fourth, and the household ran with the quiet efficiency of two people who had found a workable arrangement. Erica traveled for work regularly, contract accountancy takes you where the work is, and she had built a solid client base across several London firms as well as occasional Manila contracts when family circumstances required. I did not examine these trips closely. A man of my generation does not examine his wife's professional life. You trust or you don't, and I trusted. Janet visited twice a year, and she and Erica were not close, but they were civil. Edward visited at Christmas, and the visits were fine. Nothing alarming, nothing that stood out. The waters were calm, and I was a man who had decided, after the turbulence of the preceding years, that calm waters were enough. My tax return for the fourth year of the marriage was prepared by an external accountant, a young woman named Claire, who had taken over the practice of my long-standing accountant after he retired. Claire was thorough in a way that her predecessor, who had known me for decades and operated on a baseline of comfortable assumption, had not been. She requested documentation I was not accustomed to providing. She cross-referenced my declared assets against HMRC's records in a manner more detailed than I was used to. And in March of the fourth year, she called me and asked me to come into the office for a conversation about some discrepancies. I went in on a Wednesday morning, an ordinary Wednesday, expecting the kind of minor irregularity that generates a letter and a small adjustment. I sat across from Claire, and she placed a printout in front of me and said, in the careful flat voice of a professional managing a large piece of information, Mr. Thornberry, I need you to look at these accounts and tell me which ones you recognize. There were 9 accounts listed. I recognized 3. I looked at the other 6 for a long time. I said, I don't know what these are. She said she knew that. She said that was what she needed to discuss with me. She explained that 6 accounts had been opened in my name with my national insurance number, my date of birth, my address, in 2 cases my signature, in others a digital authorization that had apparently used my credentials at 3 different banks over a period of 4 years. The accounts had received deposits and made withdrawals throughout that period. The current balance across all 6 accounts was £4,200. The total throughput, the total amount that had passed through them since opening was £550,000. I sat in that office for a long time after she finished speaking. I remember the quality of the light through the window, which was gray and ordinary. I remember the sound of the street outside. I remember thinking, with the specific detached clarity that sometimes arrives in the worst moments, that I had spent 31 years in financial policy and I had not known this was possible. Not that accounts could be opened fraudulently, I knew that in the abstract, the way you know statistics about things that happen to other people, but that a person could do this within a marriage, that a spouse could construct an entire parallel financial infrastructure using your identity, in your name, with your credentials, across 4 years of shared breakfasts and Sunday afternoons and ordinary evenings in the flat, without you knowing. I had not known that was possible. Now I knew. I did not go home immediately. I sat in a cafe near Claire's office for perhaps 2 hours. I ordered tea and did not drink it. I thought about the banking consolidation in the 2nd year, the spreadsheet, the changes she had handled, the authorizations I had signed. I thought about the trips, the regular travel, the Manila contracts, the weekends away. I thought about the account statements I had stopped receiving in paper format when she had pointed out, correctly, that online banking was more efficient. I thought about the passwords she had helped me set up on the banking apps on my phone. I thought about every moment across 4 years in which I had handed her a piece of the system without examining what I was handing her or what she could build from it. She had not taken my money clumsily. She had not drained a single account suddenly or dramatically. She had moved money in amounts and across time frames carefully calibrated to stay below the thresholds that trigger automatic review. She had opened accounts gradually, used them precisely, closed some before I might have noticed a statement, and funneled the aggregate across a structure complex enough that it took a thorough external accountant 4 years after the fact to identify it. She had used her professional knowledge with complete deliberateness and considerable skill, and she had done it while living in my flat, eating meals I paid for, attending Christmas dinners with my son, and telling me, on the occasions when I said something like it, that she was glad we had found each other. I drove home in a state that was not quite anger yet. Anger requires energy, and what I had was something more like the specific numbness of a load too large for immediate processing. I parked outside the flat and sat in the car for perhaps 15 minutes before going up. I thought about Patricia, which surprised me not in a useful way, not with any particular insight, just the involuntary reaching for the person who was supposed to be there for the worst moments. She was not there. She had not been there for 3 years. I went upstairs. Erica was at the kitchen table with her laptop open, working, as she always was in the evenings. She looked up when I came in and said, "You were a long time." Her voice was normal. Her expression was normal. She looked like herself, composed, contained, the particular quality of stillness she had always had. The table had 2 mugs on it, which told me she had made tea at some point and expected me home. That detail lodged in me somehow. The tea, the ordinary expectation of my return. I said, "Claire found some accounts." She said nothing for a moment. She looked at me. Her expression did not collapse the way I suppose I had expected it to. It shifted, very slightly, the way a professional's expression shifts when a situation they have been managing moves into a new phase, a controlled recalibration, not a breaking down. Then she said, "I think we should talk about this." I said, "Yes, I think we should." What followed was not a confrontation in the way that word usually means. There was no shouting. She did not deny it. She did not run. She sat at that kitchen table and she talked for nearly 2 hours in a voice that remained almost entirely level. And what she said was more devastating than denial would have been because it was coherent. She said she had grown up with very little and had spent her adult life working for security she could never quite reach. She said she had loved me, she used the past tense, and I noticed, but that she had also always known the marriage would not last forever, that I was old and she was not, that the natural end of our arrangement was a point beyond which she would have nothing. She said she had been building a reserve. She said it the way an accountant explains a provision as a structural necessity, as rational forward planning, as something any competent professional in her position would have done. She was not apologizing for the decision. She was explaining its logic, and the logic, delivered in her flat professional voice across our kitchen table at 9 in the evening, was something I had to work very hard not to find coherent. I asked her where the money was. She said it had been moved offshore, in stages, through accounts she had controlled. She said she would not be giving me a routing path or an account number. She said it with the calm of someone who had already thought through this conversation and decided in advance what they would and would not say. I asked why she had stayed as long as she did, if this had been her plan from early on. She said because she had not wanted to leave until the amount was sufficient, and the amount had only become sufficient in the preceding year. She said that with the same flat honesty she had always had, the honesty had not changed, only what it was honest about. She told me one more thing before I asked her to leave. She said that what had existed between us had been real to her in the ways that it could be real, that she was not a person who felt nothing, that the years had not been purely transactional from her perspective. She said this quietly and with what appeared to be genuine seriousness, and I looked at her across the kitchen table, and I could not tell whether it was true or whether it was the final professional move in a 4-year operation. And I still cannot tell, and that uncertainty is perhaps the thing I carry most heavily even now, because if some part of it was real, then I have lost something in addition to the money. And if none of it was real, then I have lost something else, some version of my own judgment that I need to believe in to function. I called my solicitor the following morning. His name is Jeffrey, and he has been my solicitor for 20 years, and he is not easily unsettled. But the call that morning unsettled him visibly enough that I could hear it across the phone. He engaged a financial fraud specialist within the day. The fraud specialist, a woman named Dr. Patel, who worked with a firm that dealt specifically with this category of case, spent 2 weeks tracing the account structure and produced a report that confirmed Claire's initial finding in much greater detail. 6 accounts, 4 years, £550,000 throughput. Current recoverable balance, effectively zero. The money had been moved through a sequence of transfers designed to create maximum tracing difficulty. Dr. Patel said it was not an amateur structure. She said she had seen this pattern before, in cases where the perpetrator had specific professional knowledge of banking systems. She said it with the careful neutral language of her profession, but I heard what she was not quite saying. Erica had moved out of the flat during the 2 weeks of the investigation, not dramatically, not in response to any ultimatum from me, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who had known they would be moving and had been ready. She left no note. She took her things in one trip on a Tuesday afternoon when I was meeting Jeffrey, and by the time I came home the flat was exactly as it had been before she arrived, minus the things she had brought and plus a particular quality of emptiness that was different from the emptiness of bereavement. Patricia's absence had been heavy. Erica's absence was clean. That said something I did not want to look at directly. Edward drove down from Edinburgh the weekend after. He did not say "I told you so." He had never actually said anything to tell me so about, just the careful neutrality of a son who had reservations he had chosen not to voice. He sat in the kitchen and drank tea and listened to everything, and at the end he said, very quietly, "Dad, I'm sorry." I said I was sorry too. We sat for a while without speaking, which is the most honest thing 2 people can do with something that has no adequate response. He offered to stay for the week, and I told him honestly that I would rather he went home to his family, that I was not in danger of anything, just in need of quiet time to process things that were too large to process in company. He understood. That is the good thing about a son who has known you his entire life. He understands what you mean when you say you need to be alone and does not interpret it as a rejection. He did ask me one question before he left, standing in the hallway with his bag on his shoulder. He asked whether there had been any signs I had missed. I thought about it carefully before I answered, because Edward asked it as a genuine question, not as a leading one, and it deserved a genuine answer. I told him that, in retrospect, I could identify moments where a more suspicious person would have looked harder, the trips that came in clusters, the occasional brief evasiveness about specific contract details. One evening in the third year, when I had gone to use my laptop and found it open on a browser window she had not quite closed in time, which showed a page about offshore account management that she had explained away as research for a client and which I had accepted without pressing. I had not pressed because pressing felt like distrust, and distrust felt like the wrong register for a marriage that was working. I told Edward all of this, and he nodded and did not say anything, and I was grateful for that too. Janet was less contained. Janet called the following day and was, for approximately 12 minutes, very straightforwardly angry in a way that was actually useful, the external expression of something I was too exhausted to express myself. She said words about Erica that I will not repeat here, but that I listened to without interrupting, because sometimes what a person needs is someone to be angry on their behalf. Then she asked what I needed, and I said I honestly did not know. She came to London for the following weekend, and she cleaned the flat from top to bottom in the specific practical way of women who express love through action, and I let her, and it helped more than I expected. She also, without being asked, went through every room and quietly removed the small objects that Erica had left or introduced into the flat, a set of decorative items from the sitting room, some kitchen things, a mirror in the hallway that had arrived with her and that Janet apparently found aesthetically objectionable on its own merits. By the time she finished, the flat looked more like mine again. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. The legal process moved the way legal processes move, slowly, procedurally, with the particular grinding patience that the law requires even when everything is clear. Jeffrey filed the fraud complaint. The police opened an investigation. Interpol was involved at one point, which sounds more dramatic than it felt. It felt like more paperwork, more waiting, more careful language from professionals managing expectations. Dr. Patel's firm produced documentation that was thorough and damning and, practically speaking, difficult to act on because the money was offshore and Erica was, by then, in Manila, and the reciprocal legal arrangements between the United Kingdom and the Philippines in matters of financial fraud are not straightforward. This was explained to me several times by several different professionals in several different ways, all of which added up to the same fundamental reality. Recovery was possible in theory and unlikely in practice, and the costs of pursuing it aggressively might well exceed any realistic recovery amount. I made a decision in the autumn of that year, after 6 months of legal process, to stop. Not to abandon the complaint that remained active and would remain active, but to stop making the recovery the center of my life. Jeffrey had been clear that the investigation would continue regardless of my daily emotional investment in it, and that continuing to invest that energy was unlikely to produce proportionally better outcomes. He said it kindly, as a long-term solicitor says things to a client he has watched age across 2 decades, and I heard what he meant. Let it go as a daily preoccupation. Find something else to put in the center. I have had time, since then, to sit with everything and to try to understand it with something more than raw emotion. I am not entirely sure I have managed that, even now. What I have managed is a kind of clear-eyed account of what actually happened, stripped of the versions I preferred at various points. Erica Reyes was an accountant. She was, as far as I could verify, genuinely qualified in the ways she presented herself. Her professional knowledge was real and substantial. What I do not know, what I will probably never know, is when she decided to use that knowledge the way she did. Was it from the beginning? Was it a decision made later, once she understood my financial situation more completely? Was it something in between, an opportunity she recognized and eventually chose to take, rather than a plan she arrived with? I do not know. The not knowing is its own particular discomfort, because it changes the nature of every memory. If she decided from the first evening in the hotel bar, then nothing was real. If she decided later, then some of it was real and some of it was not, and I have no way of knowing which was which. Both possibilities are painful in different ways. What I know for certain is this: she used her professional knowledge to construct, inside our marriage, a financial structure designed to transfer my money into accounts she controlled. She did it carefully, over 4 years, in a manner that required both expertise and sustained deliberate intent. She was not impulsive. She was not desperate in the immediate sense. She was, in the most uncomfortable reading, strategic. And the thing that gave her the access she needed was not a weakness in the banking system or a gap in the law. It was my trust, my decision, made from the habits of a lifetime and the particular vulnerability of a man in grief, to hand the system to someone I believed was on my side. The flat in Lewisham is mine. The pension is mine. I have what I need to live, carefully. The £550,000 is gone, and I have accepted, after considerable time and considerable resistance, that acceptance is not the same as approval, but is nonetheless necessary. My son calls every Sunday without fail, which he has done since Patricia died, and which he continued through everything, and which is, in its quiet consistency, the most sustaining thing in my life. I see Janet monthly. I have had coffee with Brian twice when he has come back to London to visit family, and the second time I told him everything, and he listened in the way a good old friend listens, without judgment, without "I told you so," without offering solutions to things that have no solutions. He just listened. That was enough. I want to tell you something. If you are the kind of person who might find yourself in any part of what I have described, I am not going to tell you not to trust people. The mistake, to the extent that I made one, was in allowing my trust to become operational, in allowing someone I trusted to manage the systems that protected me, without maintaining my own parallel engagement with those systems. I had spent 31 years in financial policy, understanding that oversight exists not because people are untrustworthy, but because systems without oversight are vulnerable regardless of the trustworthiness of the individuals within them. I knew this. I had applied it professionally for my entire career, and I suspended it in my personal life because grief had made me want to be cared for more than I wanted to be careful. That is the honest account of it. Not that I was foolish, not that I failed to see obvious signs. The signs, in retrospect, they were not obvious, they were subtle and professional, and embedded in a structure that was specifically designed by someone with expert knowledge to be invisible to someone without that same knowledge. The red flag was not something I missed. The red flag was the very thing that appeared to be its opposite: her competence, her expertise. The professional precision that made her seem safe was the precise thing that made her dangerous. I am 73 years old. I live in the Lewisham flat. I check my bank accounts every morning, all 3 of them, carefully, in a habit that has become as automatic as making tea. I have a standing appointment with Claire every quarter to review my financial position. I have given no one, and will give no one, operational access to my accounts. These are not paranoid measures. They are the measures of a man who learned, at considerable cost, what oversight is for. I am telling you this because somewhere out there is another retired person, a man or a woman. It does not matter who is lonely and who has met someone capable and warm and professionally reassuring, and who is beginning, slowly and with the best of intentions, to hand that person the keys to the system. And I want them to hear, from someone who did exactly that and paid exactly the price, that it is possible to care for someone and to be careful at the same time. That those 2 things are not in opposition. That the person who asks you to trust them unconditionally, without verification, without maintained oversight, is asking you for something that no trustworthy person actually needs. Erica Reyes did not need my unconditional trust. She needed my operational negligence, and I gave her both, because I did not understand the difference when it mattered. I do now.